Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. You'll want to stick around for today's story if you like dragons and portals. It's written by Jenelle Leanne Schmidt, who first fell in love with stories through her father's voice reading books aloud each night, which is actually a great reminder for me to get back into the habit of reading chapter books to my kids before bed. Jenelle still hopes to find a passage to Narnia, but in the meantime, she makes up fantastical realms of her own. She lives in Wisconsin with her knight in shining armor and their 4 hobbits, and when she's not writing, she homeschools said hobbits and helps them along on their daily adventures, which she says makes her a wizard. Stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from Jenelle. For now, please enjoy Dragon Ward by Jenelle Leanne Schmidt. Gwenna pressed her back against the rough bark of the tree, fervently wishing she could turn invisible. The cut on her arm stung, throbbing with every pulse of her heart. Her breaths were deafening, and she tried to steady them, to silence them, as the air passed from her lungs through her lips, in and out, in and out. In desperation, she strained her ears, concentrating, listening for the sounds of pursuit. She was a hunter, unused to being the prey. The terror coursing through her was dishonorable, and shame rose in her throat like bile. The forest floor shook. Gwenna waited, her arrow notched. She reached for calm, but it eluded her grasp. A roar thundered around her, and she fumbled with her bow as the beast burst into view. The day had started out so well. "Careful now," Gwenna's father cautioned as she lowered the final frame into the apiary. He held the smoker up to the hive, keeping the bees quiet. When she finished, they stepped back, pulling off their veiled hats and grinning at each other. "This has to be the best harvest we've ever had," Gwenna exulted. She surveyed the farm, dotted by orderly hives. The cloudy sky belied the heat of the warm term afternoon. It was a relief to peel off the long gloves and heavy outer garments she wore to protect herself from stings. Her father nodded his agreement and wiped the back of his hand across his forehead. He glanced down at his daughter, a glint in his eyes. "Next thing is to extract the beeswax. You ready to help me with that?" Gwenna groaned. Her father laughed, putting an arm around her shoulders. "I'm teasing," he assured her. "Go on. I know you're dying to get out in the woods with your bow. Thank you for your help over the past few weeks. After all that, you deserve at least a few hours to yourself." Gwenna squealed and threw her arms around his neck. "Thank you, father. I promise I'll help with the wax tomorrow." He waved a hand. "Go on, get out of here before I change my mind." Gwenna started to dash away, but her father's voice halted her, a warning note in his tone. "Remember to stay away from the cliffs." Gwenna waved an arm at him. "I wasn't planning on going that way," she called back. "Besides, I don't need any more lectures from Nana Roizen about the dangers of magic." Her father chuckled, and Gwenna ran into the house to change and retrieve her most precious possession, her bow. Though she worked hard helping tend the bees, archery was Gwenna's true talent. With her bow, she kept food on the table, even through years with less bountiful harvests. The woods were her favorite place to be, stealthily creeping through the trees in search of a suitable quarry. Here, she was at peace. Here, she was master. She had not counted on stumbling upon a dragon. Dragons were rare in Lycaon, ever since the breaking of the world, but they did exist. The great beasts harbored a bitter hatred of humans. Her father said it was because of the wizards, but Gwenna felt that was unfair. It wasn't her fault that her ancestors had broken the world when they tried to eradicate the myth folk during the war. It wasn't her fault that drops of their blood ran through her veins. But she had learned to keep a wary eye on the sky, never expecting to find one on the ground. Now, as the dragon roared into view, Gwenna just had time to wonder how the day had turned into such a nightmare before she released her waiting arrow and fled. She did not wait to see if her bolt found its mark. Running, leaping over fallen logs, scrambling over obstacles, she dashed deeper into the forest. The pounding of her footfalls thudded in time with her racing heart. Her feet found a path, and she darted down it, leaping over a little brook that sang and burbled its utter lack of concern. A squirrel raced up a tree and chattered angrily at her. From under a bush, a pheasant shot into the air, startled by her noisy approach. The forest scattered before her flight. Knowing that she had no chance against a dragon, her mind whirled off to thoughts of her father. He would never know what had become of her. Her eyes darted frantically, taking in the landmarks as she raced away, her mind churning, reaching, searching for something, anything that might offer her a hope of escape. The doorway. The option that suddenly presented itself to her made her miss a step. She stumbled and fell, rolling over and over. Gwenna rose to her feet in a wary crouch, but the sound of pursuit was not as close as she had feared. The dragon must have gotten tangled in the narrow path. Why did it not take to the sky? Surely it would be easier to hunt her from above. As she paused to catch her breath, she considered the idea that had sprung to her mind. She glanced around, examining her surroundings. Yes, she was close. She might make it to the doorway in time. She chewed nervously on her thumbnail, her grandmother's warnings echoing in her mind. Did she dare? A thunderous roar made her decision. This time, her flight was not one of blind recklessness. Gwenna sped through the forest with grim purpose. Her plan was unthinkable, bordering on insane, but it might save her life. Another roar, this time followed by a wave of heat. The sound of dry branches and leaves catching fire and crackling in the blast of dragon's breath behind her urged her legs to pump faster. Up ahead, the forest thinned out onto an open, grassy hill. Beyond the trees, she glimpsed the stretch of blue sky turning to deep purple. Streaks of gold and pink chased their way through the clouds, telling her that night approached. She assumed the dark would not help her. Legends all agreed that dragons could see even better in the blackest of night. But the view of the hill and the sky bolstered her confidence. She now knew exactly where she was. For the space of an eye blink, she hesitated. Once out of the forest, her cover would be gone. There would be no trees to hide her from the dragon's fury. But there were no other options, and no room for wavering. Gwenna left the forest and dashed up the hill. Beyond the summit, there was nowhere to go. The slope ended abruptly in sheer cliffs high above the ocean, but she did not need to reach the summit. She envisioned the beast behind her sneering with malevolent delight at the thought of its prey presenting itself to be eaten in such a thoughtful manner. But the predator did not know that Gwenna had one trick left on the Caradoc board, one roll of the dice yet to play. Another crashing sound came, louder than before, as though the entire forest was being ripped up by its roots. Almost there. The ground quaked. She glanced back and saw the enormous dragon emerging from the forest. In another moment, she would be a mass of charred ashes, or on her way down the creature's throat. Frantically, she wondered if dragons swallowed their prey whole the way some serpents did. She hoped not. Being swallowed alive to die slowly inside a dragon's stomach sounded like the worst sort of fate. If only she could reach the doorway in time. The doorway, where was it? Her frantic eyes scanned the hillside before her. Where? Ah, there. A faint silver arch shimmered in the waning light of day. 10 more paces, and she would reach it. Another would take her through. Gwenna did not allow herself to think. The time for faltering was done. No matter that nobody knew what the doorway was, or that nobody had yet been brave enough to enter. What mattered was the chance it offered. A slim chance. If not to survive, then at least to die on her own terms. A wave of heat washed over her, and she shuddered in mid-flight. But it was not fire, not yet. Fire would come next. With a strangled scream, she squeezed her eyes shut and dove through the portal. When she finally opened her eyes, Gwenna was unprepared for the sight that greeted her. She pushed herself to her knees, blinking in confusion. Blackness surrounded her, pricked by thousands of tiny specks of light. Were those stars? "What hast thou done?" a voice roared, so near that Gwenna flinched. She reached for the comfort of her bow, but found that she had lost it somewhere. Her father would be furious. It was a good bow, beautifully crafted and expensive, but worth it for the food it brought to the table. Her fingers scrabbled, searching for it on the smooth ground, but it was not there. Desperation filled her as an angry roar reverberated through the darkness. She had not expected the dragon to follow her inside. She crawled forward, hunting blindly, her heart in her mouth. Suddenly, the world changed and shifted. The blackness surrounding her slid away, and without warning, she found herself back in her village. The dragon's eye rested on the tops of the trees to her right, a fiery red orb sinking toward the horizon. Gwenna blinked as friends and neighbors rushed past, shouting and jostling. What was going on? "Daughter!" Her father's voice made her spin around, a ready excuse on her lips for not bringing home any game. But it died as she began to remember. They were under attack. She had been heading to the watchtower. Why had she stopped? Her father appeared next to her, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. "May your arrows fly true," he whispered. Then he was gone. With a full quiver rattling against her back, Gwenna raced to the watchtower where the other archers would be gathering. The hill upon which the tower stood provided the village with a fair amount of defense against any attack from the ground, and the best vantage point from which to shoot anything that attacked from the sky. But the lack of cover also brought a certain amount of danger. When she reached the watchtower, the others were already assembled. She saw the familiar faces of her friends and fellow archers. She had trained with them since her youth, and they greeted her now with tight nods. They were arrayed in a well-ordered line beneath the illusion of safety provided by the tall wooden structure, their bows strung, arrows out, as they waited for their target to appear. Gwenna joined them, lacing up the bracer on her arm. She drew an arrow and held it loosely in her bow. point trailing toward the ground in preparation. A massive shadow winged overhead. Gwenna heard her friends counting quietly, and she joined them, taking deep, calming breaths. 1, 2, 3. The winged beast dove closer, unaware that he had been spotted. 4, 5. He grew larger, filling up the sky. 6, 7, 8. His wings beat once, twice. She raised her bow. 9. A glint of golden eyes pierced through her. He opened his mouth to rain fire down upon her defenseless village. 10. But they were not defenseless. Now! The air filled with the slight thrum of bowstrings as the archers loosed their arrows into the sky. Gwenna released her own arrow with a deep satisfaction. Her aim was true. Her chest lit on fire as though pierced by a blade. The dragon's scream of pain cut like a whip through her soul. Anguish coursed through her. An answering shriek burst from Gwenna's own throat. She collapsed, even as the dragon plummeted from the sky. The voices of her friends were garbled and concerned, asking where she was hurt, but she could not answer. She curled up into a ball around her inexplicably shattered heart, weeping. Gwenna! Gwenna! Somebody shook her by the shoulder. Gwenna, are you well? Slowly, she opened her eyes, surprised to find that she was not covered in blood. The hole in her heart still ached, but there was no visible wound. At the base of the hill lay the enormous creature she had helped bring down. Ignoring the concerned inquiries, Gwenna descended. With faltering steps, she approached the mighty beast. Trembling, she reached out her hand and laid it on the mighty head just above his eye, out of which protruded the shaft of an arrow. Gently, she brushed her fingers over the wild pheasant feathers, taking note of the hint of blue dye on the tips, her own personal fletching pattern. Sorrow overwhelmed her, and tears spilled down her face. Sobs racked her body as she sank to her knees. She did not understand why she was crying. She only knew that she felt as though a part of her had been slain with the dragon. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught the hint of a silver glimmer. Despite her tears, she was drawn to look up. Beyond the corpse stood a doorway outlined in radiant light. Without conscious thought, she rose to her feet and drifted toward the door. Her father called out to her, urging her to stay and celebrate. The victorious shouts of her friends beckoned, but she could not join them. A driving, compelling force directed her to walk through the doorway, and she could not refuse. Straightening her shoulders, Gwenna obeyed the command. With sure, purposeful strides, she passed through the door. She collapsed on the other side in the cool twilight air. Her fingers dug into the grass and dirt of the ground, and she wondered if this were real or just another vision. Her breath came in great gulping sobs left over from the remembered pain of the strange vision she had received. She was aware that she no longer stood on the hill. She was back in the forest. Tall trees and a ledge of mossy rock rose up on her right. And on her left, Gwenna froze as she realized that she was not alone. A great dark shape loomed to her left, radiating warmth and emitting the same shaky, shuddering breaths as herself. Instinct took over, and she crouched, ready to either flee or stand and fight, whichever course of action offered her the best chance at survival. As her eyes adjusted in the dusky haze spreading over the land, Gwenna's breath caught. Before her stood the most magnificent beast she had ever seen. It boasted 4 powerful legs, ending in sharp, deadly talons. Its body was covered in scales. She thought they might be red, but she could not be certain in the near darkness. A long, graceful neck arched up into the sky. 2 golden eyes, the eyes from her vision, peered at her with suspicion and mistrust. And yet, there seemed to be a hint of curiosity in them as well. Over its back were folded massive wings. "Oh, you beautiful creature," Gwenna gasped. She stared, unable to utter another word. Never had she dreamed that such majesty could exist in a single being. Her feet were frozen to the spot, but her spirit urged her to move forward, to touch the scales, to climb up and sit between its wings, to experience the freedom of flight. The moment of awe was broken as the dragon shied away, rearing up on its hind legs away from her. "What trickery is this?" He roared the words into the air. "What didst thou do to me?" The dragon whipped his head around and stared. "The doorway! Where did it go? Did I truly come out the other side, or is this another cursed vision?" "What?" Gwenna gasped. "Where hast thou brought me? This place!" The creature spun in a circle, knocking Gwenna to the ground with his great tail. "I didn't bring you anywhere," Gwenna shouted, scrambling back to her feet. "You were the one chasing me, remember? I've never been through the doorway before, for obvious reasons. I mean, it's magic, and magic is dangerous. My people stay away from that place. I only went in to avoid being burned to a crisp and eaten. You didn't have to follow me." Heat filled her cheeks as she shouted each word. The dragon lowered his great head to peer into her face. "Thy words ring true," he said. "Then we have come out the other side?" Gwenna hesitated. I think so." This felt real, but she could not be quite sure. She was, after all, talking to a dragon, not exactly a common occurrence. The dragon shuddered. "The things I witnessed in there. The things I did." He straightened. "I am Keltarka of the Windlash kin. Forgive me for chasing thee. I merely sought to protect myself." "Protect yourself?" Gwenna's eyes widened as she noticed the awkward way Keltarka was holding his right wing and the thick blood dripping down his side. "Oh," she gasped. "You are hurt." "Careful," he cautioned as she moved to get a better look at the wound. But it was too late. A drop of the molten liquid fell on Gwenna's shoulder, and she cried out as pain seared through her. Her vision narrowed and grew foggy. As she fell into darkness, she thought she heard a new voice speaking, but she could not place it. When Gwenna regained consciousness, she found herself lying on a cot in a small house not unlike her own. She blinked and sat up, groaning as the skin on her shoulder stretched and burned. "Ah, you are awake. I was beginning to think you would sleep the day away." A thin, blond man looked at her from where he sat at a small table, mashing something in a wooden bowl. "Where am I?" "Not far from where you fainted. You are lucky I happened to be passing by. I did not know which village you came from, or I would have taken you home." He tilted the bowl, revealing a thick paste. Kind blue eyes twinkled at her in concern. "I am making this to put on your burn, if you will allow me." Gwenna looked down at her shoulder and winced as the sight of the reddened blister sent a new wave of fire shooting down her arm. Please, she gasped. The man stood and limped over to her. Seating himself on a chair by her bed, he applied the paste to her wound and then carefully wrapped a long, clean cloth around her shoulder. I am sorry about your shirt. The man's words barely registered. I needed to cut off the sleeve to treat your wound. No, don't do that, he exclaimed as Gwenna shrugged, an instinctive gesture that ended with her gritting her teeth against a new wave of torment that sent bright flashes across her vision. As the man applied the poultice, the pain diminished. Though it did not immediately disappear, it was no longer all-consuming, and Gwenna found herself wondering about a great many things. The last thing she remembered was looking at the dragon. The dragon! She struggled to throw off the heavy blankets. Whoa now, the man said. The poultice will help, but you are in no condition to— The dragon! Gwenna cut him off. Where is he? Is he— A knowing smile ghosted across the man's face. He is well. Keltarka is currently outside, sleeping in my garden. I am fairly certain he has crushed my tomatoes. A woeful expression filled the man's face, and then he waved a hand. But no matter. Plants have never been my specialty anyway. Gwenna breathed a sigh and rested back against the flat pillows. Good. I thought maybe he had flown away. You care about what happens to him, do you? No, I mean, yes. I mean, I don't know. We went through something in that corridor. I'm not sure I understand any of it, but until I get answers, I don't really want him flying off and leaving me to puzzle through it on my own. I don't think there's any danger of that. What do you— Her question was interrupted by a forceful ringing in her mind. She clapped her hands to her head. Ow! The man glanced at her in concern, but she could not focus on him over the sudden throbbing in her temples. Forgive me. The pain lessened, leaving behind nothing more than a quiet voice, not altogether unpleasant. What? Gwenna asked. I did not mean to overwhelm you. I can read your thoughts, though I'm not sure why. You're not a dragon, are you? The voice brimmed with curiosity, and she noticed a lack of formality in this mental communication. No, I'm not a dragon. What is happening? Gwenna all but shouted. The man raised an eyebrow. Should I be concerned about you? He asked. Are you often prone to these sorts of nonsensical outbursts? Gwenna waved a hand at him. Not you. The voice in my head. I mean— She stopped, her ears heating up as she realized how ridiculous she sounded. A strange expression crossed the man's face. I see. Try answering without speaking out loud. Gwenna gave a frustrated shake of her head. How do you propose I do that? Just try, the man urged. Gwenna gave a sigh and leaned back against the thin pillows. Squeezing her eyes tightly shut, she focused her thoughts. Hello? She tried a single, tentative word. Hello? The reply was cautious, nowhere near the eager bounding it had been earlier. What is this? Gwenna wondered. Who are you? My name is Keltarka. You are— Gwenna's eyes sprang open as awareness struck her. She stared at the man. Are you a dragon? She asked. No, the man chuckled. I am not, and neither are you, it would seem. But apparently going through the doorway together has awakened a bond between you and Keltarka that has not been seen before. Between me and a dragon? Gwenna scoffed. That's impossible.
It was,
The man agreed.
Are you still there?
The voice had returned.
Are you well?
She did not want to answer. She could not be speaking to a dragon with her mind. This was not possible. It was not safe. She would not. She could sense the creature's worry, his anxiety as he waited for her answer. She sighed. I am well. His answering joy was a sunburst in her head, but this time it did not hurt. This was a warm, sweet ray of happiness that cradled her in its embrace. She felt a twinge of astonishment. She had not realized that dragons, those cold-blooded scaled monsters, could experience such depth of emotion. Her own feelings seemed suddenly pale and shallow in comparison. The man was still stealing furtive glances from the corner of his eye, even as he appeared to be busying himself with more herbs. Can I go outside and see him? She asked. The man considered it, his head listing to one side as he studied her. At length, he reached for a cane and used it to push himself to a standing position.
Other than the wound on your shoulder, I do not believe anything is terribly wrong with you, he said. We can go out. It's time to change his poultice anyway.
Gwenna swung her feet out of the narrow bed and stood. The room swayed dangerously, but she gritted her teeth when she saw the stranger's concern and willed the world to right itself. It did, slowly, and she took a tentative step. The floor became stable beneath her feet, and she felt a surge of triumph. She followed the man outside and found to her surprise that the dragon's eye was just beginning to rise, throwing the gardens into misty dawn. Hues of lavender and gray painted the landscape. The air had taken on a chill through the night, and Gwenna wrapped her arms around herself, wincing as the movement sent a fresh throbbing through her shoulder. She gazed around the garden, taking in the neat rows of flowers, the beds of herbs, the trimmed hedges, and wondered how this little homestead could have escaped her notice. How had she missed seeing this cottage, this well cared for garden, in all her traversing of the forest surrounding it? She reached out to tug at the man's shirt and ask the question, but the words died on her lips as her eyes found the dragon. He was enormous. Even in his recumbent pose between daylilies, hyacinths, and tall tomato plants, he towered over her. Her glimpses of him before did not do justice to his true size. He was easily larger than the cottage.
Ruining my tomatoes! I knew it!
The man snorted, jabbing his cane in Kaltarka's direction, but neither anger nor regret tinged his tone. It was more as if he said it because it was the expected thing to say. As he approached, no fear or timidity tainted his movements, and Gwenna envied his ability to appear so at ease. She, on the other hand, was rooted to the spot, planted like one of the garden flowers. Though a part of her yearned to move closer, a spark of fear prevented her from taking another step.
Good morning, Kaltarka,
the man said.
May I take a look at that wing of yours?
The dragon shifted so that one of his golden wings lowered. The man peeled away the poultice, and Gwenna glimpsed the slash of crimson. Concern bolstered her forward. Her feet tumbled one after the other until she stood right behind the stranger. Kaltarka swung his great head at her movement, and suddenly, Gwenna found herself nose to nose with the beast. Hurt clouded in his eyes, a swirl of silver in their golden depths.
Beast? Is that how you perceive me?
Gwenna cursed herself for letting the startled thought loose. Forgive me. I did not mean it. My people do not encounter dragons often, and the stories about you are the kind we tell around the fires to frighten one another. Your people hate mine, and my people fear yours. A sadness poured through her. Keltarka's thoughts rolled through her mind.
It is true. The mystic wars still haunt us. My people still remember it. Some are still alive who fought in it, though it is unfair to hold you responsible for the actions of your ancestors.
He raised his head and looked at the man tending his wound.
What is happening? He asked aloud. How is it that I can speak mind to mind with this youngling? What was that place that showed me her death and pierced my heart as though it were I who had died 1,000 deaths?
You had a vision? Gwenna asked. Inside the doorway, you saw me die? Keltarka lowered his head in assent.
By my claw, he rumbled.
I experienced the same thing. Gwenna bounced on her toes, her fright forgotten. Except I watched you felled by my own arrow. It was like my own heart was being torn in two. She glanced at the blond man. He had paused in his ministrations, his brow furrowed as he considered them both. Do you know what that place is? My Nana says the door is magic, and that we should stay away from it. She tells a story about the people who first discovered it. One of them threw a rock inside and it disappeared. After that, nobody wanted to investigate any further.
The door appeared shortly after the Mystic Wars ended, he replied. I have my suspicions as to its origin and purpose, but I needed time to rest and to heal. Until today, nobody had gathered the courage to step through the doorway. I made sure of that. But my wards were not enough to deter true need. And now...
He trailed off, then shook his head, a rueful smile touching the corners of his mouth.
Well, it appears that the two of you have been linked, perhaps forever. Two halves of a whole, separated to protect you, and reunited to make you stronger. You are the answer to the breaking of the world.
What? Gwenna asked, her chest constricting. What does that mean?
I cannot tell you what it means, for I am certain that it means many things, the man replied.
He paused, and then nodded, as if to himself.
But I think it is safe to say that the doorway is a gift from Cruithior Elkiel himself.
He paused again.
It will require study. There is wisdom among your peoples, is there not?
He directed the question at both of them. The girl and the dragon nodded together.
Good, the man replied. We will need to gather them. This is a puzzle that must be solved. He grinned. But first, we must be off.
Abruptly, he strode away, back to the cabin. Gwenna stared at Keltarka and found her confusion reflected back at her in the eyes of the dragon. Before they could speak, however, the man returned, a pack in his hands and a mandolin slung over his back. He handed the pack to Gwenna.
Here, you can carry this. I believe you are both up for a bit of travel.
Where are we going? Gwenna asked as she took the pack.
To your people, of course, the man replied,
as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. Why? Gwenna dropped the pack on the ground in horror.
To tell them what has happened, he said. They will need to see proof of your bond, and once they do, I think everyone will be more reasonable. It will be easier to convince the kin. We cannot go to my people, Keltarka thundered,
and a shock of dread coursed through the bond between them.
I wasn't supposed to be this far from the Enclave to begin with. If I go home with a weakling human...
He trailed off, and she felt an apology waft toward her. She waved it aside. My people will not attack us if they see me, though Nana is going to be so furious, Gwenna said. But how can we make them understand? And why must we? Can't we just pretend this never happened? A quiver of anguish shuddered through her as she said the words out loud, but she could not be certain whether the emotion was her own or if it came from Kaltarka. No, the man said patiently. The bond has been forged. It cannot be unforged. You are connected, and to be separated would not be healthy for either of you. No, we cannot go back. You must go forward. Strengthen this bond. Learn its limits. Teach others. You are the first of something new. There will be more like you, and you must be ready to lead them. Gwenna shivered. She did not like what he was saying, but she could not deny the veracity of his words. They rang with a truth that echoed within her soul. Father and Nana will not be happy about this, she said grimly. Not at first, perhaps, the man acknowledged. But in time, they will come to see the benefit of having a family member warded to a dragon. Kaltarka growled, and his talons dug into the soft earth. His tail lashed, and as his wings spread, Gwenna feared that he would take to the skies and disappear. The sudden heartbreak at the thought of never seeing him again left her gasping for air. As she gulped, Kaltarka grew still, his golden eyes turned toward her in wonder. Then he nodded slowly. We will try it thy way, he said. Then he tilted his massive head and eyed the man. Thou hast not told us thy name. With whom are we to be traveling? The man gave a jaunty grin and spread his arms wide. My good dragon, my dear girl, surely you recognize me from the legends? Why, I am the minstrel, Karyne Kane. Kaltarka's whole body rippled with surprise, and he half rose. Karyne Kane? The Karyne Kane? The man gave a flourish, his cane whipping out to one side. The one and only. Kaltarka lowered his mighty head in a formal bow. My kin have waited a long time to offer thee thanks, minstrel. We will never forget what thou hast done for us. A beatific smile lit the man's face. And I thank thee, Kaltarka, for reminding me of my true calling. He tossed his cane away. I have rested here in convalescence long enough, and the world has rested with me. But I am not a gardener, nor am I a guardian. I am a minstrel, the minstrel, and your arrival has convinced me that it is time Lycaon moved past the war and started healing. Gwenna stared from the man to the dragon and back, her mind awhirl with questions. But the one that burst from her lips had nothing to do with the confusing words exchanged between Karyne and Kaltarka. When your wing is healed, can I... She began, then faltered to an embarrassed halt, unsure if her request would be considered presumptuous, or worse, insulting. And yet, the yearning which began the moment she exited the cottage had only grown as each moment passed, until she could no longer keep it to herself. But in the end, she did not have to ask the question, for Kaltarka understood. When my wing is strong once more, little ward, we will fly together, he promised. I hope you enjoyed listening to Dragon Ward by Jenelle Leanne Schmidt, narrated by Karyne Norton. If you want to read more by Jenelle, go to JenelleSchmidt.com to find more of her books. I will also have a direct link in the show notes to where you can subscribe to her newsletter to get this short story for free, along with another short freebie, which is a Jack and the Beanstalk retelling with kind of evil but cute kittens. Some of you have been listening since the show started, and others have been recently binging all the episodes. Either way, I love getting your messages telling me how much you love the podcast, and knowing that the handful of hours I spend on this each week is doing so much good. If you have an extra minute, please consider leaving a review so others who are hunting for fantasy podcasts can get a sense of whether or not they'll love finding fantasy reads. If you're not sure how to leave a review, check out today's show notes for some easy instructions. Think of it as your birthday gift to me. I turned 41 on Sunday, so we can aim for 41 reviews, right? No, not really. I think we're at like 14 or something. But seriously, every single one makes my day a little brighter. So if you've enjoyed the podcast, go leave a review. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.